The sky above the ridge was burning green, and I was counting the seconds until my line broke. My name is Vexthel Oren, and I have commanded soldiers of the Coalition for 11 cycles of this endless war. I have watched allies fall silent one by one, their worlds swallowed by the Skarn Dominion, an empire that does not ask for surrender, only obedience. On that morning, on a frozen ridge on the world called Dorith Prime, I believed we had perhaps one more day before our line collapsed completely. The comm channel in my ear crackled with static and fear. Soldiers from 3 different species stood beside me in the trench, gripping their weapons with shaking hands, watching the horizon where Skarn walkers moved like slow, patient predators. We were the last defense before the supply routes to 4 systems. If we fell, so did they. "Command, this is Oren," I said into my comm, requesting reinforcement status. The reply came slow, tired. "There is none, Commander. You are the reinforcement." I closed my eyes for a moment. Around me, my soldiers were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before something terrible. A young Threll engineer named Bess sat near me, tightening a strap on her equipment over and over, though it was already secure. I understood. When there is nothing left to control, you control what you can. "Do you believe the old stories, Commander?" Bess asked suddenly, not looking up from her strap. "Which stories?" "The ones about the vanished people. The ones who used to fight wars like this and always won. My grandmother told me about them when I was small. She called them the Quiet Ones, said they disappeared long before the Dominion ever rose." I almost smiled, though there was little reason to. Every species in the Coalition had some version of this story. In my own culture, we called them the Sleeping Kin, a race so fierce in war that they eventually chose silence, retreating from the wider galaxy rather than be drawn into endless conflict. Nobody could say where they came from. Nobody could say if they were real at all. It was the kind of story soldiers told each other in the dark, not because it was true, but because it made the dark feel smaller. "I believe it is a nice story," I told her. "Nothing more." Bess nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer, and went back to tightening her strap. The walkers on the horizon began to move faster. I raised my scope and studied the approaching line. Skarn forces did not fight with mercy or hesitation. Their soldiers were bred for obedience, their commanders bred for cruelty, and their war machines were built with one purpose: to break resistance completely. I had seen entire cities go dark in a single night under their advance. I had seen commanders far more experienced than myself lose their nerve completely when the walkers came close enough to see clearly. "Hold position," I said over the open channel, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "We hold as long as we can. Every hour we buy is an hour for the evacuation ships behind us." Nobody answered, but nobody ran either. That was something. The Dominion forces reached firing range within the hour, and the ridge became a place of chaos and noise. I will not describe every detail of what happened next, only that we held longer than anyone expected, and that by midday, half of my soldiers were gone from the line, pulled back wounded or worse, and the Skarn walkers had not slowed even slightly. It was during a brief pause in the fighting, while my remaining soldiers reloaded and caught their breath, that the strange transmission came through. At first, I thought it was Skarn interference, some kind of trick meant to confuse our communications. The signal was garbled, broken apart by distance and static, but certain words came through clearly enough. Coordinates, a request for safe passage, and a single word repeated 3 times, like someone testing whether anyone was listening. Earth. I had never heard that word before. I checked with my communications officer, a sharp young Corvith named Polly's, who looked as confused as I felt. "It is not in any database I can access, Commander," Polly said. "Not a system name, not a species designation, nothing." "Could it be Dominion?" "I do not think so. The signal pattern is completely unfamiliar. It does not match Skarn communication protocols at all." I filed the mystery away, because there was little time to consider it further. The Skarn advance resumed within the hour, and I returned my full attention to the battlefield in front of me, where the true danger waited. By the time the sun began to set behind the ridge, painting the frozen ground in long orange shadows, I understood that we would not hold until nightfall. My soldiers were exhausted. Our ammunition reserves were nearly gone. The evacuation ships behind us needed at least 3 more hours to finish loading the wounded and the civilians from the nearby settlements, and I did not believe we had 3 more hours to give them. I remember standing at the edge of the trench, watching the walkers advance in their slow, mechanical rhythm, and thinking that this would likely be the place where my service ended. I had made peace with that thought many times before in this war. It did not frighten me the way it once had. What frightened me was the silence that followed. The walkers stopped. All of them at once, as if some invisible hand had reached down and paused the entire battlefield. My soldiers noticed immediately, weapons still raised, breath held, waiting for some new horror to explain the sudden stillness. I raised my scope again and studied the Skarn line, searching for the reason. That was when I saw the ships. They came from above, descending through the clouds without warning, without the slow deceleration burn that every ship in Coalition space used to avoid detection. These ships simply appeared, sleek and dark, moving with a kind of precision that made my instruments struggle to track them properly. I had studied the ship designs of every species in known space during my service. I had never seen anything like what I was looking at now. "Command," I said into my comm, my voice tighter than I intended. "We have unidentified vessels entering the battlefield. Multiple contacts. They are not Dominion." "Copy that, Commander. We see them too. Stand by." The unidentified ships did not attack immediately. Instead, they positioned themselves between my line and the Skarn advance, hovering low over the frozen ground with an ease that seemed almost disrespectful of the danger around them. My soldiers stared in stunned silence, and for the first time in hours, nobody was reloading a weapon or checking their equipment. Everyone was simply watching. My comm crackled again, but this time it was not command speaking. It was a new voice, calm and steady, with an accent I had never heard in my life. "This is Callum Ashworth. We picked up your distress signal 3 hours ago. Sorry it took us a while to get here. The jump calculations were tighter than we liked." I stared at the comm unit as if it might explain itself further on its own. Bess, beside me, had gone completely still, her strap forgotten in her hands. "Identify yourself," I managed to say. "State your affiliation." There was a short pause, and when the voice returned, I thought I could hear something like amusement in it. "Yeah, that's going to take a bit of explaining. Short version, we're human. Long version, we'll get to that. Right now you've got a bigger problem in front of you, and we'd like to help with that first, if that's all right with you, Commander." Human? The word landed in my mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every assumption I had built over 11 cycles of war. I thought of Bess's grandmother's story. I thought of the sleeping kin, the vanished people, the myth soldiers told each other in the dark to make the darkness feel smaller. "You are the ones from the old stories," I said, before I could stop myself. Another pause, longer this time. "Guess word travels even out here. We can talk about that later, too. Right now, I'd suggest your people take cover, because we're about to make some very loud noise." I did not have time to ask what he meant. The unidentified ships moved as one, breaking formation, with a speed and coordination that made my scope readings blur trying to keep up. They struck the Skarn walkers, not with the slow, grinding exchange I had watched all day, but with something faster, sharper, more decisive. I watched 3 walkers fall in the time it had taken my forces to disable a single one earlier that morning. The Skarn line, which had advanced with such patient confidence for hours, suddenly found itself pushed backward, scrambling to reform, its usual discipline breaking apart under the unexpected pressure. My soldiers began to cheer, a ragged, disbelieving sound rising up from the trench line. I did not cheer. I stood very still, watching the battlefield transform in front of me, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Hope, mixed with a deep, uneasy confusion. "Commander," Polly's voice pulled my attention back to the comm station. "I am picking up ground forces deploying from the human ships. Small numbers, but they are moving directly toward the Skarn flank." I raised my scope once more and watched figures emerge from the descending ships, moving across the frozen ground with none of the caution my own soldiers had learned through years of costly experience. They moved like they had done this 1,000 times before, like the frozen battlefield in front of them was nothing new at all. One figure paused near the edge of my scope's view, and even from a distance, I could see her turn toward my position, raising a hand in something like a greeting, before continuing forward without any hesitation. "Command, this is Oren," I said, my voice finally steady again. "The situation has changed, requesting updated orders." There was a long pause on the other end, filled with the distant sound of other officers speaking urgently in the background. "Commander," Command finally replied, "hold your position and observe. We are trying to understand what just happened ourselves." I looked out over the ridge, where the Skarn advance that had seemed unstoppable only an hour earlier was now being pushed back by soldiers I had believed belonged only to bedtime stories and old campfire tales. Bess stood beside me, her strap finally forgotten completely, watching with wide eyes. "You said it was just a story," she said quietly. "I did," I admitted. "I was wrong." Somewhere out on that frozen ridge, humanity had just stepped out of legend and into my war, and I understood, even in that first confusing hour, that nothing about this conflict would ever be the same again. The Skarn retreat did not last through the night. I learned this the hard way, standing in a command tent 3 kilometers behind the ridge, watching updated battlefield readings scroll across a display screen, while officers from 4 different species argued about what to do next. The human ships had pulled back after breaking the Skarn advance, and their soldiers had withdrawn just as quickly, leaving behind a battlefield littered with disabled walkers and a great deal of confusion. "They gave no explanation," said Commander Fales, an older Threll officer whose patience had worn thin over the long war. "They appeared, they fought, and they left. This is not how allies behave." "They saved the ridge," I said. "Perhaps that is explanation enough." Fales gave me a look that suggested she did not agree, but she did not argue further, mostly because nobody in that tent had a better theory to offer. The truth was that none of us understood what we had witnessed. I had spent the hours since the battle trying to piece together everything I knew about the old stories, comparing notes with soldiers from other species who had grown up with similar legends. Every version was different in small details, but every version agreed on one thing. The vanished people, whoever they truly were, had once been fighters unlike any other, and then they had simply disappeared from the wider galaxy. Now they were back, and the Skarn Dominion was about to learn exactly why so many old stories had been built around them. The attack came just before dawn. I was still awake, reviewing reports in the command tent, when the alarms began sounding across the camp. Skarn forces had regrouped faster than anyone anticipated, launching a full assault along the entire ridgeline in an attempt to reclaim the ground they had lost the previous day. I grabbed my equipment and moved toward the trenches, my soldiers already scrambling into position around me, exhaustion replaced by the sharp focus that comes only in moments of real danger. The Skarn line this time was larger, angrier, clearly determined to erase the embarrassment of the day before. I took my position at the trench and prepared myself for what I believed would be a much harder fight than the last one. The human ships arrived before the Skarn line reached firing range. I do not know how they knew to come. Perhaps they had sensors far more advanced than anything the Coalition possessed. Perhaps they had simply expected the retaliation and stayed close by, waiting. Whatever the reason, their ships descended through the pre-dawn darkness with the same startling speed as before, and this time, I was able to watch more closely as they engaged the Skarn advance. What I saw changed everything I believed about warfare. The human forces did not fight with overwhelming numbers. There were perhaps 30 soldiers on the ground, supported by a handful of ships, against a Skarn force numbering in the hundreds. By every rule of warfare I had learned across 11 cycles of service, this should have been a slaughter in the Dominion's favor. Instead, I watched the human soldiers move with a kind of coordinated chaos that made no logical sense to me at first, splitting into small groups, striking from unexpected angles, retreating when it made sense to retreat and pressing forward when it made sense to press forward, never following the predictable patterns that every other species in this war relied upon. Callum Ashworth's voice came through my comm again, partway through the engagement. "Commander Oren, you still with us?" "I am here," I replied, watching a group of human soldiers hold a narrow chokepoint against a much larger Skarn force, buying time for something I could not yet see happening elsewhere on the field. Your soldiers fight strangely. There was a short laugh on the other end. Strangely good or strangely bad? I have not decided yet. Fair enough. Ask me again in an hour. I watched for the next hour, and I understood by the end of it exactly what he meant. The Skarn Dominion had built its reputation on discipline, on overwhelming force applied with cold precision. Every species in the coalition had learned to fight the Dominion by trying to match that discipline as closely as possible, forming tight defensive lines, holding position, hopping to grind down the Dominion's advance through sheer endurance. It rarely worked. The Dominion simply had more soldiers, more machines, more patience for a war of endurance than we did. The humans did not try to match Skarn discipline at all. They broke every pattern I had ever studied, and in doing so, they made themselves impossible to predict. A Skarn commander trained to counter coalition tactics found himself facing something entirely unfamiliar, and I watched that unfamiliarity cost the Dominion dearly throughout the morning. By midday, the second Skarn assault had failed just as completely as the first. I met Callum Ashworth in person for the first time later that afternoon, when he requested a meeting at the edge of the human landing zone. I walked there with Polly's and 2 of my remaining soldiers, uncertain what to expect from a species I had believed, only a day earlier, existed solely in campfire stories. He was younger than I expected, though I understood quickly that judging a human's experience by their appearance would be a mistake. He stood near one of the strange, dark ships, dressed in simple, practical clothing, rather than the elaborate uniforms coalition officers often wore, and he greeted me with a casual nod, rather than the formal gestures I was accustomed to. "Commander Oren," he said, "good to finally meet you properly. Sorry about the mess out there. Wasn't exactly a clean fight." "You fought better than any allied force I have witnessed in this war," I said honestly. "I have questions." "Figured you would. Walk with me." We walked along the edge of the landing zone as he spoke, and I listened carefully to everything he told me, though much of it raised more questions than it answered. Humanity, he explained, had indeed withdrawn from wider galactic contact many generations ago, after a conflict with another species that had taught them a difficult lesson about announcing their presence too openly. They had spent the intervening years rebuilding, preparing, and watching the wider galaxy from a careful distance, waiting to see how the balance of power would settle. "We heard about the Dominion a while back," he said. "Been keeping an eye on things. When your distress signal came through strong enough to reach our listening posts, we figured it was time to stop watching." "Why now? Why this battle, this world?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the questions seriously before answering. "Because if we don't step in somewhere, eventually, there's nowhere left standing to step in for. We've seen empires like the Dominion before. A long time ago, closer to home. We know how this story goes if nobody stops it early." I studied him carefully, trying to read the kind of certainty in his expression that I had seen in commanders who had faced true horror and survived it. There was something old in the way he spoke, something that did not match his youthful appearance at all. "Your people fought a war like this before," I said. It was not quite a question. "More than one," he replied simply. "It's part of why we went quiet for so long. Needed time to heal, time to make sure it never happened to us again. But watching your ridge almost fall yesterday, watching how close it came, that's not something we can just observe from a distance anymore." I thought of Bess's grandmother's stories again, the vanished people who fought wars and always won, who disappeared not because they were defeated, but because they chose silence after some great cost. I began to understand that the old legends had gotten one important detail correct, even if every other detail had blurred with time. Humanity had not vanished because they were weak. They had vanished because victory itself had cost them something enormous, something that took generations to recover from. "There are others like you," I said. "More ships, more soldiers." "A fair few, yeah. This is a scouting force, mostly. We wanted to see how bad things really were before committing anything larger. Based on what we saw yesterday and today, I think Command back home is going to want a much bigger conversation with your coalition leadership." That larger conversation happened 3 days later, when a coalition delegation, myself included, met formally with a small group of human representatives aboard a neutral station near the edge of contested space. I will not describe every detail of those negotiations, only that I watched skepticism slowly give way to cautious hope among leaders who had grown accustomed to nothing but losses for many years. The Skarn Dominion, for its part, did not remain quiet for long. Word of the Ridge battle spread quickly through Dominion channels, and I later learned that Skarn Command had initially dismissed the reports entirely, assuming some kind of coalition trick or exaggeration. That assumption did not survive their second encounter with human forces, which took place along a different front only a week later, and which ended even more decisively than the battle at the Ridge. I was not present for that second battle, but I heard the reports afterward from officers who were, and the details stayed with me for a long time. A Skarn strike force, sent to punish a coalition supply world for its continued resistance, arrived expecting an easy victory against a poorly defended target. Instead, they found 3 human ships waiting for them, positioned with an understanding of the terrain and the approach routes that suggested careful planning rather than luck. The Skarn strike force did not achieve its objective. More importantly, for the first time in the entire war, a Dominion commander sent a formal communication to coalition leadership, not a demand for surrender, but a request for information about the new arrivals. I understood then that something fundamental had shifted in this war, something that went beyond a single battle or a single ridge. Humanity was no longer a myth whispered around campfires to comfort frightened soldiers. They were a presence on the battlefield, and the entire galaxy, both coalition and Dominion alike, was going to have to reckon with what that presence truly meant. I returned to my unit a changed officer, carrying with me a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief, because for the first time in years, I believed our side might actually survive this war. Unease, because I had begun to understand that the humans who had arrived to help us were not simply powerful allies. They were survivors of something far worse than what we currently faced, and I found myself wondering what exactly it would take to push a species like that into hiding for so many generations in the first place. Bess found me that evening, sitting near the edge of the camp, watching the stars where the human ships had returned to patrol the outer perimeter of our territory. "You look troubled, Commander," she said, sitting down beside me without waiting for permission, a habit of hers I had long since stopped correcting. "I am trying to understand something," I admitted. "We have been given a gift, Bess, powerful allies exactly when we needed them most. I find myself wondering what price that gift will eventually ask of us." She considered this for a long moment, watching the same stars I was watching. "My grandmother used to say that the quiet ones only broke their silence for something worth breaking it over. Maybe that's not a warning, Commander. Maybe that's just the truth of who they are." I did not have an answer for her that night, and in truth, it would take many more battles, many more conversations with Callum Ashworth and the growing number of human forces arriving to support our failing lines, before I began to understand the full truth of what humanity was, and what had truly driven them into their long silence in the first place. But even then, on that quiet evening beneath the stars, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever the old stories had gotten wrong about the vanished people, they had gotten one thing entirely right. The world was about to change, and there would be no going back to the way things had been before. 3 months after the Ridge, I was assigned to something I never expected in my entire career. Coalition Command, eager to understand our new allies as quickly as possible, formed a series of joint units pairing experienced coalition officers with small human teams operating along the most dangerous sections of the front line. I was given command of one such unit, working alongside a human strike team led by a woman named Freya Lindqvist. I met her for the first time on a transport ship heading toward the contested moon of Karth, a barren rock that had become one of the most fought-over positions in the entire war due to its strategic location between 3 major supply routes. Freya was not what I expected, though by then I had learned to expect the unexpected from humans entirely. She was quiet where Callum had been talkative, precise in her movements in a way that reminded me of the most disciplined coalition soldiers I had ever served alongside, except sharper, faster, more economical with every gesture. "Commander Oren," she said, extending a hand in the human greeting gesture I had grown somewhat accustomed to by then. "Heard good things. Heard you held a ridge with half your soldiers and no ammunition left. I held it because your people arrived in time, I said honestly. I would not call that success entirely my own. She studied me for a moment, something like approval flickering across her expression. Good. Officers who take all the credit tend to make bad decisions later. Officers who understand where the credit actually belongs tend to keep their soldiers alive longer. I found myself liking her immediately, though I did not yet understand how much that liking would be tested in the days ahead. Karth was, by every measure I understood, an impossible position to hold. The moon had no natural atmosphere, forcing every soldier stationed there to operate in heavy suits that limited movement and made every action slower, more deliberate, more exhausting. The Skarn Dominion had committed a significant force to capturing it, understanding correctly that whoever controlled Karth controlled the supply routes feeding 3 separate coalition fronts. Losing it would mean losing far more than a single moon. My joint unit consisted of 12 coalition soldiers and 8 human soldiers under Freya's direct command, tasked with holding a series of underground tunnels that connected the moon's surface installations to its deeper mining facilities. It was, by any traditional measure, far too small a force to hold such an important position against the size of Skarn assault we expected. You are worried, Freya said, finding me during a quiet moment before the first assault began, checking equipment in the dim light of our tunnel position. 20 soldiers against an assault force of unknown size, in tunnels with limited escape routes, I said. I have learned enough tactics in this war to know when a position looks difficult. Looks difficult, sure. Is it impossible? No. She crouched down beside a piece of equipment I did not recognize, something small and compact that she was assembling with quick, practiced hands. Tunnels are actually good for us. Narrow spaces mean the Dominion can't bring their numbers to bear all at once. Means we can hold a choke point with a handful of soldiers against a much larger force. As long as we're smart about it. You have fought in tunnels before. She looked up at me, something distant crossing her expression briefly before it cleared. Once or twice. A long time ago, somewhere else. It's not something I particularly enjoy remembering, but it taught us things that are useful now. I did not press her further, sensing that whatever memory lay behind those words was not one she wished to share in detail. I had begun to notice this pattern among the human soldiers I encountered, a kind of weight they carried quietly, rarely spoken of directly, but always present beneath the surface of their calm confidence. I understood, slowly, that the stories about humanity's long silence were not simply about strategy or caution. They carried something heavier than that, something that had shaped every human soldier I had met into the kind of fighter who approached even the most desperate situations with a strange, hard-earned steadiness. The first Skarn assault on our tunnel position began just after the moon's long artificial night cycle started, when visibility outside the surface installations dropped to near nothing. I had expected the Dominion to wait for daylight, following the patterns I had studied throughout years of warfare against them. Freya had expected exactly what happened instead. They'll come at night, she had told me hours earlier, checking the same compact piece of equipment she had been assembling before. Numbers favor them in open engagement. Darkness favors them getting close before we can properly organize a response. It's what I do in their position. She was correct. The first warning came not from our sensors, which the Skarn assault force had apparently found some way to partially disrupt, but from one of her own soldiers, a quiet man who had been monitoring the tunnel entrance with equipment I did not recognize. Contact, he said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the tunnel despite its quietness. Multiple signatures moving fast. What followed was unlike any engagement I had experienced in this war. Freya's soldiers moved through the darkness of the tunnel with a coordination that required almost no verbal communication. Falling into defensive positions, I would not have thought to establish myself, using the narrow tunnel geometry exactly as she had described, forcing the much larger Skarn assault force to funnel into small groups that our combined unit could handle without being overwhelmed. I fought beside them that night, my own soldiers holding secondary positions further back in the tunnel system, ready to reinforce wherever the line grew thin. I will not describe every detail of that long engagement, only that by the time the moon's artificial dawn cycle began, the Skarn assault had been repelled entirely. Our tunnel position held completely intact, and our combined unit had suffered losses far lighter than I had believed possible against a force of that size. Freya found me afterward, checking on my soldiers with the same careful attention she gave her own, a habit I noticed she maintained throughout every engagement we shared together in the following weeks. "Your people fought well," she said. "Held the line exactly where we needed it held. Good instincts, Commander." "I learned from watching your soldiers," I admitted. "The way you use the tunnels, the timing of your movements. I have never seen tactics like that before." She was quiet for a moment, sitting down heavily on a crate near the tunnel entrance, exhaustion finally showing through her steady exterior now that the immediate danger had passed. "We learned those tactics the hard way, a long time ago, fighting an enemy that outnumbered us badly, in places not so different from these tunnels. It's not a happy history, Commander, but it's one that keeps soldiers alive today, so I suppose there's some use that came out of it." I sat down beside her, understanding that this was perhaps the closest she had come to sharing the deeper history behind humanity's long silence, and I did not want to press too hard and lose the moment entirely. "Bess, one of my soldiers, told me a story her grandmother used to tell," I said carefully, "about a people who fought wars and always won, and then vanished because victory cost them something enormous. I did not understand that story fully until I met your people." Freya looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "That's not a bad way to put it, honestly. We won our wars, Commander, every single one of them eventually. But winning cost us things that took a very long time to recover from. Whole regions of our home world gone. Whole generations who never got the chance to grow old. When the last war finally ended, there wasn't much appetite left for reaching out to the wider galaxy and finding new fights to join. We needed time, a lot of time. And now you have decided that time is over. Now we've decided that watching another people go through what we went through without at least trying to help isn't something we're willing to do anymore. Doesn't mean it's an easy decision. Doesn't mean everyone back home agreed with it either. But here we are." She gestured around the tunnel with a tired smile. "Fighting in tunnels again, apparently. Some things really do come back around." Our joint unit held Karth for 11 more days, weathering 3 additional Skarn assaults of increasing size and intensity as Dominion Command grew more determined to reclaim the strategically vital moon. Each engagement taught me something new about human tactics, about the strange combination of careful planning and improvised adaptation that made their approach to warfare so difficult for the Skarn Dominion to counter effectively. I watched Freya's soldiers adjust their strategy after each assault, learning from every mistake, refining their positions, never repeating the same pattern twice in a way that would allow the Dominion to properly prepare a counter. It was during the 4th and final major assault on our position that I witnessed something that stayed with me long after we finally received orders to withdraw from Karth, the strategic value of the moon having shifted as the wider war continued to move around us. The Skarn Dominion, growing desperate after 3 failed assaults, committed a much larger force to the 4th attack, supported by heavier equipment than we had faced before. Our tunnel position, though well defended, began to show real strain under the increased pressure, and for the first time since I had joined the joint unit, I genuinely believed we might lose the position entirely. Freya made a decision in the middle of that engagement that I have thought about many times since. Recognizing that our main tunnel entrance was on the verge of being overrun, she took a small group of 3 soldiers and moved to hold the choke point personally, buying time for the rest of our combined force to establish a secondary defensive line further back in the tunnel system. I argued against this decision at the time, insisting that a commander should not place herself directly in the most dangerous position on the battlefield. She listened to my argument with patience, and then explained, in the calm, steady voice I had grown accustomed to over our weeks fighting together, that a commander who was not willing to hold the hardest position when it mattered most had no right to ask her soldiers to do the same. She held that choke point for nearly 20 minutes, alongside her 3 soldiers, against a Skarn force that outnumbered them dramatically, buying exactly the time our combined unit needed to establish the secondary line and eventually turn the tide of the engagement entirely. When she finally rejoined the main force, exhausted but unharmed, I understood that I had witnessed something that would become, in time, one of the defining stories soldiers told about the growing legend of human forces on the battlefield. Word of what happened at Karth spread quickly through coalition ranks in the following weeks, growing slightly with each retelling in the way that battlefield stories always do. But the core of it remained true regardless of the embellishments. A small joint force, coalition and human soldiers fighting together, had held one of the most strategically vital positions in the entire war against overwhelming odds, and had done so not through superior numbers or superior equipment, but through tactics, coordination, and a willingness to make difficult sacrifices that had, until recently, seemed entirely absent from a war that had ground down coalition morale for years. I returned to Coalition Command Headquarters shortly after our withdrawal from Karth to file a formal report on the joint unit's performance, and I found myself, for the first time in a very long time, writing a report that carried genuine hope rather than the careful, measured pessimism that had characterized most of my previous assessments throughout the war. The Skarn Dominion, I wrote, had built its entire military doctrine around the assumption that overwhelming force, applied with patient discipline, would eventually break any resistance placed in front of it. That assumption had held true for years against coalition forces alone. It did not hold true against human tactics, and more importantly, it did not hold true against the combined approach that coalition and human forces were beginning to develop together, learning from each other, adapting coalition knowledge of local terrain and long-standing Dominion patterns with human tactical innovation and hard-earned battlefield experience. I do not believe, even now, that any single battle or campaign alone turned the tide of this war. But I believe, looking back on those months, that Karth marked something important, a moment when coalition soldiers across the front lines began to genuinely believe that victory was possible again, not simply survival, but actual victory. That belief, more than any single tactic or weapon, proved to be one of the most powerful forces on the entire battlefield in the difficult months that followed. Bess asked me, when I finally returned to my original unit weeks later, whether the stories about the tunnel battle at Karth were true. Some of it, I told her honestly, though I suspect the story will keep growing larger with each retelling, the way these things do. My grandmother would have liked that story, Bess said, smiling for what felt like the first time in a very long while. The quiet ones, breaking their silence for something worth breaking it over, exactly like she always said. I thought of Freya holding that choke point, of the calm steadiness in her voice even in the most dangerous moments, and I understood that whatever the wider galaxy eventually came to believe about humanity, the truth of it, the real truth beneath the growing legend, was perhaps even more remarkable than any story could properly capture. The Skarn Dominion did not take the losses at Karth quietly. Word reached us through coalition intelligence channels, weeks after our withdrawal from the moon, that Dominion High Command had convened an emergency council to address what they were now calling the human problem. I remember reading the intercepted reports with a strange mixture of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction because an enemy that had never once acknowledged weakness was finally being forced to reckon with one, and concern because I understood, even then, that a wounded predator often becomes more dangerous rather than less. I was proven right within the month. Coalition Command summoned a wide gathering of officers to a secure station near the war's central front, and it was there that I learned the true scale of what was coming. Dominion forces, previously spread across dozens of separate campaigns throughout coalition territory, were being pulled back and consolidated into a single massive offensive, aimed directly at the growing human presence in our region. Skarn Command had apparently decided that the only way to address the human problem was to overwhelm it entirely, before it could grow any stronger or spread any further along the front. Callum Ashworth was present at that gathering, along with Freya and several other human officers I had not yet met. I noticed immediately that the easy confidence I had grown accustomed to in my previous encounters with them had shifted into something more serious, more focused, though not, I noted carefully, into anything resembling fear. "They're throwing everything they have at this," Callum explained to the gathered officers, standing before a large display showing the Dominion's projected troop movements. "Every major fleet, every ground force they can spare from other fronts. Best estimate, we're looking at their entire Western military strength converging on this sector within the next 2 weeks. Can your forces handle an offensive of that size? Asked Commander Fales, the same skeptical Threll officer I had served alongside since the very beginning of this war. Not alone, Callum said honestly, and I respected him for that honesty more than I could easily express. We're a scouting presence still, relatively speaking. What we need is exactly what Karth showed us works. Coalition forces and human forces fighting together, using what each side does best. The following 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation, unlike anything I had experienced in my entire military career. Coalition Command, working closely with the growing human liaison teams, began reorganizing our defensive strategy across the entire sector, pulling together forces from a dozen different fronts, coordinating supply lines, and establishing the kind of joint command structure that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. I was given command of a combined battle group, working directly alongside Freya's unit once again, tasked with defending a critical junction point where 3 major supply routes converged. Coalition intelligence believed this junction, which we had come to call the Hollow, would likely be one of the primary targets of the Dominion's coming offensive, given its strategic importance to the entire region's remaining defensive network. If the Hollow falls, we lose the ability to properly supply 4 separate fronts, Freya explained during one of our final planning sessions before the offensive began, studying a detailed map of the junction's terrain with the same careful focus I had come to associate with her approach to every engagement. Which means the Dominion knows exactly how valuable it is, too. They'll come here hard. How hard is hard, by your estimation? She was quiet for a moment, running calculations I could not follow on the display in front of her. Hard enough that Karth is going to look like a skirmish by comparison. This isn't going to be about clever tactics alone this time, Commander. This is going to be about how much punishment our combined forces can absorb and keep fighting anyway. I thought of the exhaustion in her voice when she had described her people's history with wars like this, wars that cost them entire regions of their home world, entire generations of soldiers who never grew old. I understood, in that moment, that whatever was coming would test not only our defensive strategy, but something deeper, something about whether coalition and human forces could truly stand together when the cost of standing together became genuinely severe. The Dominion offensive began on a morning I will remember clearly for the rest of my life, arriving not as a single overwhelming wave, but as a coordinated assault across the entire sector, striking multiple points simultaneously in an attempt to prevent coalition and human forces from reinforcing each other effectively. The Hollow, exactly as Freya had predicted, became one of the primary targets, facing a Skarn force larger than anything I had witnessed in 11 cycles of prior warfare. I will not attempt to describe every hour of that long defense, because doing so would take far longer than this account allows, and because much of it blurred together in my memory into a single continuous effort to hold ground that seemed, at times, entirely impossible to hold. What I will say is that the joint tactics developed at Karth, refined and expanded across the following weeks of preparation, proved themselves again and again throughout that difficult defense, allowing our combined force to absorb assault after assault without breaking entirely, even as our numbers slowly dwindled and our resources grew increasingly strained. It was on the 3rd day of the defense of the Hollow that Dominion Command made a decision that changed the entire character of the offensive. Recognizing that their conventional assaults were not achieving the swift victory they had planned for, Skarn forces committed their flagship vessel to the engagement directly, a massive command ship that had, until that point, remained safely behind the main lines of every previous Dominion campaign I had studied. I remember the moment our sensors first detected the flagship's approach, a silence falling across our command position as every officer present understood exactly what its arrival meant. The Dominion was no longer simply attempting to reclaim territory. They were committing everything, staking the entire offensive on a single decisive strike meant to break our defense completely. That's their command anchor, Freya said quietly, studying the sensor readings with an intensity I had not seen from her before. Take that down, and the rest of their offensive loses coordination fast. Leave it standing. And it's going to keep directing waves at us until we simply run out of soldiers to hold this position. Your assessment on taking it down?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, I heard something in her voice that I had not heard before in all our months fighting together. A kind of weight that suggested she understood exactly what she was about to propose, and exactly what it might cost. "It's possible," she said, "but it means committing everything we have left, ground forces and ships together, in a single coordinated strike. If it works, we break their offensive here and now. If it doesn't, we've got nothing left to defend the hollow with afterward." I looked around the command position at the officers gathered there, coalition and human alike, all of them waiting for a decision that would determine not only the outcome of this single battle, but potentially the direction of the entire war. I thought of Bess's grandmother's story, of the quiet ones who fought and won, and I thought of everything Freya had told me about the cost that victory had once demanded from her people, a cost that had driven them into generations of careful silence. "We commit," I said, understanding fully what I was asking of every soldier under my command, coalition and human together. "If this is the moment that decides the war, then we do not hold anything back." What followed was the largest coordinated engagement I had ever participated in. Coalition ground forces and human strike teams moving together toward the Dominion flagship under cover of a combined orbital assault that drew heavily on the ships Freya and Callum's people had brought to our sector. I fought alongside Freya directly during that final push, watching her lead her soldiers with the same calm precision she had shown at Karth, except now stretched across a battlefield far larger and far more dangerous than anything either of us had faced together before. I will not describe every detail of the assault on the Dominion flagship, both because the full account would take far longer than I have space to properly tell here, and because some of what happened during those final hours remains difficult for me to revisit even now. I will say that the cost was severe on both sides, that soldiers I had come to respect deeply, both coalition and human, did not walk away from that battlefield, and that the weight of those losses stayed with every survivor long after the engagement itself had ended. But I will also say that the assault succeeded. The Dominion flagship, that massive command anchor around which the entire offensive had been coordinated, was finally brought down in the final hours of the third day. And exactly as Freya had predicted, the rest of the Skarn offensive lost its coordination almost immediately afterward, scattered forces retreating in confusion, without clear direction from their central command. The hollow held. I found Freya afterward, sitting alone near the edge of our battered command position, watching the wreckage of the Dominion flagship burn slowly against the darkening sky, and I sat down beside her without speaking for a long while, understanding that some moments required silence more than words. "We lost good soldiers today," she finally said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "We did," I agreed, "but we held the hollow. The offensive is broken." She nodded slowly, though I could see that the victory brought her little comfort in that immediate moment. This is the part nobody tells you about in the stories that get passed around afterward. The part where winning still costs you something you can't ever really get back. I thought of everything she had shared with me over the months we had fought together, about her people's long history with wars that demanded exactly this kind of terrible cost. And I understood, in that quiet moment beside the wreckage of the Dominion flagship, why humanity had chosen silence for so many generations after their own wars finally ended. "Your people knew this cost already," I said, "and still you came." "Because the alternative was watching it happen to someone else, knowing we could have helped and chose not to." She looked at me then, something steady returning to her expression despite the exhaustion and grief still clearly present beneath it. "Doesn't make today hurt any less, Commander, but it's still the right choice. I believe that, even now." We sat together for a long while after that, watching the last light fade from the wreckage of the flagship. Two officers from entirely different worlds bound together by a battle that had cost both our peoples dearly, but which had also, finally, begun to turn the tide of a war that had seemed unwinnable for so many years before humanity's arrival on our battlefields. Word of the Hollow's defense spread through coalition territory faster than any battle before it, and Dominion Command, having lost their flagship and the momentum of their entire offensive in a single decisive engagement, found themselves forced into a defensive posture they had not experienced in decades of unchecked expansion. I understood, even in the immediate exhausted aftermath of that battle, that we had witnessed something that historians on both sides would study for generations to come. But I understood something else as well, sitting beside Freya in the fatting light, watching the last embers of the burning flagship die down into darkness. The legend of humanity that had grown so quickly across coalition territory in the months since their arrival was, in truth, only half the story. The other half, the half that mattered most, was the quiet cost carried by every human soldier who had chosen to step back into a galaxy that had once cost their people so dearly, simply because they could not bring themselves to watch another people suffer the same fate without at least trying to help. That, I came to understand in the weeks that followed, was the truest measure of who humanity really was, far more than any single victory on any single battlefield could ever properly capture. 6 months passed after the defense of the Hollow, before I understood the true scale of what had changed across the wider galaxy. The Skarn Dominion, having lost its flagship and the momentum of its greatest offensive in a single devastating engagement, found itself facing something it had never encountered in decades of unchecked expansion: real and sustained resistance across every front simultaneously. Coalition forces, emboldened by the victory at the Hollow and increasingly comfortable fighting alongside human strike teams, began pushing back against Dominion positions that had seemed unshakable only a year earlier. I watched, over the course of those 6 months, a war that had once felt like a slow, inevitable defeat transform into something I had genuinely stopped believing was possible. A war we might actually win. I remained in close contact with Freya throughout this period, our combined battle group continuing to operate together across several major engagements as coalition forces pressed their advantage along the Western Front. I watched her lead her soldiers through victory after victory with the same steady precision I had come to deeply respect, though I also noticed, in quiet moments between engagements, a kind of careful watchfulness in her that never fully disappeared, the mark of someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone I had ever served alongside, exactly how quickly fortune could shift on a battlefield. "You never fully relax, even now," I observed one evening, sitting with her near a supply depot as our forces prepared for what coalition intelligence believed might be one of the final major engagements of the war's Western campaign. "Old habit," she admitted, a faint smile crossing her face. "Comes from a history that taught us pretty clearly what happens when you get comfortable too early. Doesn't mean I'm not glad for how far we've come, Commander. Just means I'll believe this war is truly over when I actually see it end, and not a moment before." Her caution proved wise, though not in the way either of us expected. The Skarn Dominion, faced with mounting losses across every front, did not simply collapse as some optimistic officers in coalition command had begun to predict. Instead, Dominion leadership, after months of failed attempts to reverse their declining fortunes through continued military force, finally sent a formal delegation requesting negotiations, the first such request in the entire history of the Long War. I was present, by strange coincidence of assignment, at the neutral station where those negotiations eventually took place. Standing among a gathered crowd of coalition and human officers, as representatives from both sides of the long conflict met to discuss terms that would have seemed entirely impossible only a year earlier. I will not describe the full details of those negotiations here, both because much of it involved matters of diplomacy far beyond my own expertise, and because the true significance of that moment lay not in the specific terms discussed, but in the simple fact that the negotiations were happening at all. The Skarn Dominion, an empire that had never once in its long history acknowledged weakness or accepted terms it had not dictated entirely on its own, was finally sitting across a table from the very alliance it had spent decades trying to crush completely. I understood, watching those negotiations unfold, that this moment marked something far larger than the resolution of a single conflict. It marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power across the entire region, a shift that had begun, I believed firmly, on a frozen ridge many months earlier, when a small group of unfamiliar ships had descended from the clouds, and a calm voice had told me, simply, that they had heard we needed help. Callum Ashworth found me during a break in the proceedings, standing near the edge of the station's main observation window, watching the stars beyond with the same quiet reflection I had noticed in him during our very first conversation. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he said, joining me at the window. "Standing here, watching this happen. Wasn't sure I'd see a day like this when we first got that distress signal from your ridge." "Neither was I admitted. I believed, on that first morning, that we had perhaps one more day before our entire line collapsed completely. I did not expect to be standing here, watching the Dominion finally forced to negotiate." He was quiet for a moment, considering something carefully before he spoke again. "You know, back home, there's already people writing down what happened here, turning it into stories the way people always do with things that matter. Your ridge, Karth the Hollow, all of it's already becoming something bigger than just battles that happened, if that makes sense." I thought of Bess and her grandmother's old story, the tale of the vanished people who fought wars and always won, then disappeared into a long and careful silence. I thought of how casually I had once dismissed that story as nothing more than comfort offered to frightened soldiers in the dark, a myth with no real substance behind it. "I understand exactly what you mean," I said. "My own soldiers already speak of Karth and the Hollow the way my grandmother's generation once spoke of the old legends. I suspect, in time, the details will grow larger with each retelling, the way these stories always do." "Good," Callum said, a genuine warmth entering his voice for the first time in our conversation. "Let them grow. Every civilization needs stories like that, something to hold on to during the hard times. Just hope whatever version survives keeps the important part intact." "Which part is that?" He considered the question seriously before answering. "That we came because you asked, and because we couldn't stand by and watch it happen to someone else. Everything else, the tactics, the victories, all of that matters, sure. But that's the part that actually explains why any of it happened in the first place." The formal peace negotiations between the Coalition and the Skarn Dominion took several more months to fully resolve, and I will not claim that the resulting agreement satisfied every grievance built up over decades of brutal conflict. War rarely ends with perfect resolution, and this war was no exception. But the fighting slowed, then stopped almost entirely across most of the contested territories, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, Coalition worlds began the difficult, hopeful process of rebuilding rather than simply enduring. I returned to my original unit one final time before my own formal transfer to a new assignment, coordinating ongoing cooperation between Coalition forces and the growing human presence that had, by then, become a permanent and welcomed part of our region's defensive network. Bess was still there, older now in the careful way that soldiers age even over relatively short periods of hard service, and she greeted me with the same warmth I remembered from our earliest days together on that frozen ridge. "They are saying the war is truly over now, Commander," she said, sitting beside me one final evening as we watched the stars together, the same simple ritual we had shared so many times throughout the long conflict. "Mostly over," I corrected gently. "Peace rarely arrives all at once, Bess, but yes, the worst of it has passed. I believe that firmly." She was quiet for a while, watching the stars where, in the distance, the lights of a human supply vessel moved slowly across the darkness, part of the ongoing cooperation between our peoples that had become simply a normal feature of life along the frontier by then. "My grandmother would not believe how the story ended," Bess finally said, a soft smile crossing her face. "The quiet ones, coming back to help exactly when we needed them most, and staying to help rebuild afterward, too. She always said the old stories only told half the truth. I wonder what she would think, knowing the other half turned out to be even better than the legend." I considered her words carefully, thinking back over everything I had witnessed since that first frozen morning on the ridge, the confusion and disbelief giving way slowly to trust, then to genuine friendship, then finally to something that felt, in the quiet moments like this one, almost like family bound together by shared hardship and shared hope. "I believe," I told her, "that the old stories were never meant to tell the whole truth in the first place. They were meant to give frightened soldiers something to hold on to during the darkest hours, a small light of hope when everything else seemed lost. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the truth, when it finally arrives, is always meant to be something the old stories could only ever hint at, never fully capture. I think of that ridge often, even now, many years removed from the desperate morning, when I believed our entire defensive line was about to collapse completely. I think of the strange, calm voice that first spoke to me through a garbled comms signal, promising help I had never expected to receive from a people I had believed existed only in old campfire tales told to comfort frightened soldiers in the dark. Humanity was never truly a myth, though for a long time, across a wide and struggling galaxy, that was the only story anyone had left to tell about them. They were simply waiting, healing from wounds too deep to rush, watching carefully from a careful distance, until the moment finally came when silence was no longer something they could justify to themselves. And when that moment finally arrived, they did not arrive quietly. They arrived on our battlefields exactly when we needed them most, and the entire galaxy, both those who had once doubted their existence and those who had once feared what their return might mean, learned together that some legends, however old and however doubted, are simply waiting patiently for the right moment to prove themselves entirely true. I do not know what challenges still wait for us in the wider galaxy beyond our own troubled region. I do not know whether other empires, other threats, will one day test the fragile peace we have all worked so hard to build together. But I know this much with complete certainty, carried forward from everything I witnessed across those long and difficult years of war. Whatever comes next, we will not face it alone. And somewhere among the stars, ready to answer whenever the next desperate signal finally reaches them, humanity will be listening, exactly as they always were, waiting quietly for someone somewhere to need their help again.